Well, I'm bold today. I've done two little programs in Spanish, 13 minutes each, and I decided that it would be a good time this beautiful day, cooling down here in South Florida, to do session 8 of this intro to Christianity, ethics. We're dealing still a little bit with ethics. And I want to deal with spirituality and the saints and holiness in this session. I don't know that there will be a further one. I think if I go again, as long as I've been going almost an hour, I should be able to say what I want to say, and I again say it with some sort of a sense of obligation, not so much pure like or doing my thing, even though I do enjoy doing it, but I try to justify it with some sort of rationale. And the rationale really is that today's the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas. I was a Dominican for several years. I was really formed completely, theologically, even spiritually, probably to a large extent, as a Dominican friar of a certain school. So I want to be specific about that, a little bit more about my background. And I spoke this morning twice about Aquinas and what he represents as an innovator, even revolutionary to some extent. He adopts Aristotle as his philosopher and moves away from Plato, Aristotle being considered a materialist or an atheist. All knowledge comes from the senses, very scientific for the time. And so I went on about that spirit and how some Dominicans have incarnated it and were silenced and got into trouble. And then were rehabilitated a lot later, almost like the Galileo case, where the church oversteps its boundaries and then has to retrace its steps and everything. And so I want to make some contribution, further contribution to some of the things I've been saying in these videos about ethics and about positions in the church. And I think this morning I got a little bit into criticism of narrow mindedness and traditionalism in the false sense that we have people theologically ill prepared, listening to the wrong voices. And a case in point, to be very specific, Joseph Biden has been elected president. He goes to Mass daily. I think he's a very good man. He is, to put it very simply, pro choice as far as abortion. Donald Trump, to me, was a completely evil, lying, destructive man. And he decided to come out being against abortion to drag a whole bunch of the church with him. So those are very simplistic and simpleton like or a simpleton way of doing ethics. I'm showing you a picture here of a man that doesn't need to say anything, a starving African man. And so the real issues are the planet, how we live, and yes, reducing abortion as the very first maybe offense a human life can receive. If we accept from conception, which, as I said, I think before, there may be some wiggle room there for a week or two that ethicists could perhaps think about. Obviously, those kinds of things are already complications that most people don't like. They like to keep it simple, stupid, as the Alcoholics Anonymous like to say. But you really have to be able to discern things. And I think discernment is incredibly important so that um, if you want to reduce abortion or eliminate abortion, which is very difficult to do, you can certainly pay attention to how people live, how people are educated, how people are included, what kind of funds you give for programs that can help people, and a whole change of tone and a whole change of attitude and speech and reverence for the truth and for precision and for listening. These are all Christian ethical virtues in very short supply. The least ethical people are angry uh, people, people who are furious and simplistic and out to kick some dog somewhere. Not doesn't really matter who it is. This is a picture of an 87-year-old Cuban guy in Miami selling peanuts. Um, those are the kinds of things that should concern us ethically. If your only concern is for the unborn, I mean, the Pope said, do not just focus on abortion. Don't keep it simple that way. And now Biden is elected president amidst tremendous amount of lying and even violent opposition to vote counting, etc., led by the outgoing president, the biggest liar there has ever been. And the statement from the U.S. bishops is that they're worried about Biden's abortion stance. They weren't worried about what Trump was doing, all kinds of things. So that is taking political sides in the most stupid and simplistic and unethical way. So that I think that's an example of how ethics can be undeveloped or misunderstood or handled the wrong way. That's why I think Pope Francis is a spiritual man of prayer, listening, humility, and with tremendous experience that he learned from in Argentina, where he lived through a very turbulent period with liberation theology and very furious, or in Spanish we like to say enaltecido, sort of altered states of emotion on the part of the left to a large extent, the leftist Jesuits. So he was exiled for a while there, and I've read enough about it. Not that I have the clearest picture, but my impression is that he really had one of those conversions where you opt for humility and listening and this kenotic. I can't sort of emphasize that enough. Christ emptied himself. If you're full of yourself or your ideas, and you act like it, or you like people who are full of themselves and their ideas and act like it, you're looking for that dictator savior. We had Auschwitz Liberation Day, I think, yesterday. German nation voted in Hitler, then went along with everything he said. He was going to save them from humiliation. People were angry and felt put down. That's one of the worst things people can feel, is to be put down and humiliated. Now, some people, like the immigrants from Central America, who are very humble and powerless, they can be put down and humiliated, and they're not going to revolt because there's no chance. But you get, unemployed or subeducated white Americans being fed this constant poison of rage and hatred and falsehood. And you'll get a good number to go to attack the Capitol and think it was a good idea, and then have others say that has emboldened us to act out our rage. It boils down to that. It's really rage that has found targets that have been falsely presented. It's not a rational examination of what's wrong with the government or society or the legislature, and let's take a rational approach. That's what Gandhi would have done or did. Gandhi in India examined the situation. He learned from experience. In South Africa, Gandhi was a dandy when he went to London and lived, very well. But his mother had made him swear to be vegetarian. So Mohandas Gandhi started frequenting vegetarian restaurants that mostly were in the hands of people that liked the East, theosophists, and all these kinds of people. He rediscovered his Hinduism and became, the Mahatma, the great soul. But he attacked the British imperial system and presence in India in very rational ways, not ranting and raving. And really well-laid schemes are well laid by rational, smart people. Right now we're at war with COVID. Why didn't anyone protest that lying about COVID was a big sin? So you have bishops, and I'm going to say this very clearly, who have a record of swallowing the camel while they strain the gnat. And the sex abuse crisis is one of the biggest examples. You've had almost no bishop be punished for covering up the rape and destruction of so many young lives. You had the poster boy, Cardinal Law, kicked upstairs to Rome to a fine pension at one of the great basilicas of Rome. That's how they police their offenses. You had this Orthodox Legionnaire of Christ founder, Maciel, degollado, Marcial Maciel degollado. I'm forgetting things these days. Well, he was covered up because of money and power and orthodoxy. He's now, the order now is trying to continue without him, but it's an uphill battle. So in any case, I think abortion cannot be used as a political arm or as the only concern so that you can forget about everything else and consider yourself ethical. Passing a law against abortion, which is what it boils down to basically, it has symbolic value. It may have an effect on numbers, but it also will result in illegal abortions, almost like the drug thing. And not everyone is going to agree that from conception on, you have a human life that cannot be aborted. And in a pluralistic society, to impose a philosophical or religious point of view is very problematical. That's where I think Biden would come in. But what's definitely going on the other side is all this demagoguery. Abortion, 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 then forgetting about everything else, and they simplify and polarize everything along very stupid and non-thinking lines. Jesus was more subtle than that on many things, and on other things like hypocrisy, he was harshest, or lack of compassion, harshest. I think the only time we can point to an orge wrath expression attributed to Jesus is in Mark 3, when in the middle of a synagogue, a man with a withered hand is put in the middle, and Jesus asks, is it licit to do good on Sabbath instead of evil, to save a life instead of destroy it? And they kept quiet. And so Jesus looked around them, or looking at them actually, with wrath, hurt, I'm looking at my translation here, hurt by the hardness of their heart, cured the man. And immediately, very strange bedfellows, like Trump and the evangelicals and the conservative Catholics, maybe most of the white Catholics. In this case, the Pharisees and the Herodians, you don't think those guys would go together very well, even though not too much is known about the Herodians. They conspired then to find out how to eliminate him. So Jesus got eliminated not because he was taking little pious positions, but because he was confronting real issues and problems of the day. Hunger, and people wanted to make him king, and hypocrisy, and even the temple system, etc. So that I just wanted to follow up a little bit with that. I wanted to, and this is where I say that I do this sort of as a sense of obligation, because not everything is easy to do or to talk about. But another issue, and again, opposite of what I was, the gist or the direction some might think I was going this morning, to a very conservative radio audience in Spanish in South America. The issue of homosexuality and gender is a very controversial issue. And since I want to talk today about spirituality and the saints and holiness and things like that, I wanted to say something about it. I remember that when I got invited to this Hispanic theology summer session, 2-week course on Mark in Spanish, it's probably more of a liberal type of group. I expressed the idea that you cannot consider homosexuality on a par with heterosexuality as far as I think God's design. Stepping out on a limb here, but I do think that there is a natural order in nature, and that you have to respect gender differences, the complementarity of man and woman. I think the Pope agrees with that, and I see that groups like the Community of Sant'Egidio, of which I was involved with and I still am very supportive of, I think their spiritual advisor, Archbishop Paglia, Vincenzo Paglia, has spoken about this, and even Enzo Bianchi, another Italian, very radical sort of church reformer. They insist that this male and female, he created them, is something to be taken quite seriously. I personally have a conservative view of fooling around with Mother Nature. And one of the things that I think ethically and in every other way, one has to be always on guard against is jumping or deciding to believe something that is flattering to me. So that we have to be very careful as to what has convinced us. Has it convinced me because of facts, evidence, reasoning, logic, or because that's exactly what I want to hear? I'm convinced. And so I think that to accept our limitations, to accept that we may have proclivities, we may be even born a certain way, that that is not the exact image that's ideal, and to turn my situation into something that is perfectly fine because it's me, so it must be perfectly fine. It's the way I look at it. I think that's wrong. You know, there are sins we commit that are things we do that remove us from the purity and holiness that is the ideal with God. Remember Adam and Eve in the garden sin and they hide. If you want to be an athlete and you want to be in good shape, something I'm trying to do, at least starting with diet, um, you can, or a race driver. I've actually been with friends that are race car drivers. Every second counts. Every way to make a turn counts. Everything is scientifically set up to provide the maximum speed along that track. Every segment is timed and measured exactly. When your goal is perfection, when your goal is to win that race and the other guy's doing the same thing you're doing. I was talking in Spanish the other day about Paul using race and even boxing imagery to talk about competing, fighting, you know, running the good race, etc., fighting the good fight, all this kind of stuff. What I am saying is that the way we have been built by God, yes, I think that relationship is very important. And if a man and a man or a woman and a woman have a relationship, I am not going to, certainly at the civil legislative level, just like with abortion or any other topic, you have to have, you know, a pluralistic sort of compromise or living together standard where you don't impose rules that are not necessary. And so you live with people that you may have differences with, respecting the boundaries and respecting everybody's space. So I'm you know, completely for you know, legislation that recognizes the parity, as there is parity between any kind of orientation or gender, or now they have all kinds of categories of gender, etc. And that has to be respected, but I think you also have to respect a theological position that says God intended nature to go a certain way. It doesn't always go that way. So you sometimes do the best you can, but not to the point of blurring images that and symbolic relationships that I think are reflective of other realities. And I think the whole man woman complementarity is an essential kind of distinction. You can't blur that. Now, that doesn't mean that you know you You can't approve of people loving each other of the same sex, etc. Changing your gender or conforming your body to what you are convinced you were born as, sex change or transgendering, etc. That's a tougher one for me. As I used to say to my classes, I don't even like tattoos or piercings. You can imagine, how I might feel about, really messing with Mother Nature. But people get these, deep-seated longings, and we have to respect that. I think that's part of the kenotic attitude that I've been talking about, the emptying ourselves of ourselves and try to embrace the other as the other is found. But that doesn't mean that we lose sight of this ideal that I think the Bible has, that we can discern from philosophy and theology and the tradition of the church. That includes abortion too. It's not, or other sins, masturbation or whatever. All these sins, all these violations of conscience, as a Carmelite once pointed out to me, hurt us. They reduce that level of holiness, purity, consecration to God, clinging to God, ability to cling to God, that I don't think is the ideal. Henry Nouwen is a beloved spiritual author. May he rest in peace. I actually heard him speak when he was at Harvard more than once. I sat in on his class. I went to his house. I think he had the house at 45 Francis Avenue. If it wasn't 45, it was, I think, Francis Avenue, a guest house. And I went in there and sat at the table and everything. He was gay, and they talk about his being so lonely, tortured, etc. But I think he was a valiant man. He uh, explored. He went to San Francisco. Was a little bit shocked at some of the outlandish manifestations of sexuality, etc. But he was always on a quest, I think, for God and for the good. Ended up with being at L'Arche, this place founded by Jean Vanier, of which we have to say something about in a second, for extremely, I call them, handicapped people. I mean, you can come up with all the euphemisms you want, special abilities or something, but they needed to be taken care of in everything. Very tough stuff to do. And Henry Nouwen ended up there as a maybe the final uh, quest for God amidst all the suffering that he endured, like everybody else endures suffering. I didn't have the ideal family life or upbringing. I don't have the ideal character. I don't have the ideal proclivities. I'm a limited, wounded person, but I don't try to justify everything that I may want or desire as all right, because I cannot ever accuse myself of anything. That's not correct. Speaking of L'Arche, the Ark, the founder, Jean Vanier, he had a tremendous encounter with a Dominican, I think Father Thomas Philippe, who said to him, you should invite this handicapped man or two to your house and take care of him. And Vanier was an aristocratic type of French Canadian guy, perfect English, perfect French, etc., reputed to be a living saint. Living saint. And I heard him speak on video, etc. He died not long ago, a few years ago, and then it came out. he would pressure these adoring female spiritual directees into having, sex of some sort. He abused this relationship. So this is a man who not only spoke in the loftiest terms about holiness and love, which is the essence of holiness, is love, but actually did it by having founded these houses where you could say the least of our brethren were lovingly taken care of, mostly by rather educated, preppy sorts that prefer things to be very nice and educated and clean and neat. And then it turns out that even he was not able to do what was right. To first of all, I'm sure he must have realized, being a brilliant man, that when you have a position of authority and people look up to you, you have a greater responsibility to not let them down. And we're all capable of doing that. I've done it. You allow that temptation to take over, with or without the aid of alcohol or something else. And now you listen to that other voice. And if you do it once and then you say, oh my God, what did I do? But if you get into the habit of it, which is what's really bad, then it's very hard to stop. And then you get these incredible contradictions. A man seeking holiness, a man having done a great act of demonstrating what we should do as members of the church, caring for each other. And then you let that tear get in among the wheat, or let your field be sown by the evil one to mess up your crop. That happens a lot. And I do think that that's where honesty is essential. The truth. Today I spoke about it with Aquinas and the Dominicans, veritas, the motto. And contemplata alistradere, to share with others the fruits of your contemplation. That's still what I'm trying to humbly do after not having remained with the Dominicans. I wish I could have remained with the Dominicans in Mexico. I've said that I would have done what I later finally began to do much better, much longer, much more effectively: study and teach theology or the Bible. Instead, I was confused. My parents had died. I derailed. I didn't cooperate. I didn't have mentors. Everything is mixed together. We are mixed bags. That's one of the conclusions I arrived at the last few years, and I was told that literally as a lawyer. One time they told me, you're a mixed bag, you have these good points and bad points. So that's a humble kind of conclusion, which I think you're on the right track, actually, when you have that kind of humility where you don't have to defend yourself or try to save yourself. That's where we can judge sometimes people. We do and should. They're braggarts and liars. No way good fruit can come out of that. Just no way. And you can't look at it aside and say, it's just a peccadillo, it's a quirk of personality. No. It ends up with assaults on capitals, etc. or COVID's out of control. Australia had 900 deaths from COVID. Very stringent government programs. This country, well known, 4% of the world's population, uses a lot of the Earth's energy, but it's got, I think, a quarter of the deaths from COVID in the world, or something like that. A horribly mishandled life and death crisis. If that's not unethical, if you're poo-pooing your scientists and laughing at those who wear masks, that's very unethical. And if you say no, but I'm against abortion, wipe my slate clean, that's not gonna work. Not everyone who says Lord, Lord. So that holiness is being close to God. Something we like to do. It's very hard for us to maintain ourselves so close to God. I've read a lot about the saints. Charles de Foucault went to the Sahara after being a bon vivant, a drinker, eater. I don't think he womanized too much, but he was a crazy guy, a very talented explorer, ended up going to the Sahara to imitate Jesus' hidden life. But if you read, what he writes, he's not always on cloud nine or anything. He struggles like everyone else. But he made this fundamental decision. I'm not going to certainly not violate any principles. I'm going to follow good principles of brotherhood. And if my ideal was solitude and silence and undisturbed contemplation, but my reality is that they're seeking for me to help or for me to be involved with my neighbors in the Sahara being these Bedouins, I am going to do that. A big part of ethics is to know how to respond to something. Aquinas would teach that. Aquinas would talk about the virtue of justice, give everyone what his due, or in a way you could say do the right thing is the virtue of justice. Then the virtue of prudence is knowing how to apply that general principle to concrete situations. And so the ability to discern that, I would say at the top of the list of ethical obligations is the awareness of our limitation, awareness of our egoism and how we tend to justify what we want to justify rather than look at it objectively. And then the capacity to discern situations and discern what is right. Those Pharisees, which is a caricature, but as they're depicted for our own edification, not to hate Jews, but the Pharisees are depicted this way in the Gospels so that the Pharisees in us and in our community can be recognized and for what they are. Picayunish about certain things and forgetting the larger things, swallowing the camel while you strain the gnat, and vice versa. So these guys were hooked on the manual that Sabbath, you can't do certain things. And Jesus himself, points out to them in the prior chapter that David and his men ate a bread that's only for the priests, etc., because they were hungry, etc. The Sabbath is made for man, not man for the Sabbath. This has to be understood too, but the point being that you have to have this kind of common sense and wisdom, just related to prudence and the other virtues, and knowledge or science or whatever, to be able to determine what's right. And this requires, prayer and reading and contemplation and quiet time and being allergic to liars and loud people. Let's put it that way. when I hear these commercials and they're yelling, and I'm saying, well, what kind of audience responds better if you yell at them? Are they that distracted, or is that what gets them excited, that you're yelling for them to rush out and buy a car somewhere? Uh, Ethics has to do with not being distracted. We can learn a lot from the Buddhists in that regard. Mindfulness, compassion, turning anger into compassion. That's a Buddhist maxim. This energy that is anger, instead of giving free rein to it, and that'll result in buying guns and then finally using them. But if we turn it into compassion, better everyone's situation, improve the world. Okay, my taxes are gonna go up a little. That's fine. I have too much money. Well, then you have a big problem, because if you're so attached to it, you will be blind completely. It'll be harder for you to enter into the kingdom of heaven than for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle. Unless you are classy, like I said, I think Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, and you played some sort of the game that you like to play, which is making some products or services and then making a lot of money out of it too. You like to compete, that's fine, but then you have enough wisdom and enlightenment to say, I'm going to do the right thing. I don't need 80,000 cars. Warren Buffett supposedly drives an old car. So we should learn from those kinds of people. Thérèse of Lisieux, I wanted to talk about her too, because Charles de Foucault and Thérèse of Lisieux were said by Yves Congar, which I'm going to try to find his photo here, because I want to show that. The two lighthouses, the two lights, in the lighthouse that announce the 21st or the 20th century. So you have this guy that goes out there to give silent testimony with the Muslims. He's not out there to preach till he's blue in the face, as I heard one priest say one time. You're not going to convince anybody by preaching till you're blue in the face, but to give a silent testimony before the Muslims of El Hermano Universal. I read it in Spanish, the universal brother. And so this man, Yves Congar, that I was privileged to have lunch with him, he was one of these Dominicans silenced during Pius XII years of repression of any theological novelty, ecumenism, all kinds of stuff that some people are now trying to go back to. So all this stuff that we've been there, done that a million times, but some of these people have discovered, like the story of the guy that went into the church and heard the priest talking about how the Jews killed Jesus. He goes out into the street, finds a Jew, and starts beating him up. It's in Leo Rosten's The Joys of Yiddish story, I think under Messiah entry, but I don't know. And so the Jew goes, why are you beating me up? He goes, you killed Jesus. And he goes, but that was 2,000 years ago. The guy goes, yeah, but I just found out about it. C.S. Lewis said, those who don't know history tend to become slaves of a fairly recent past. So that Congar was silenced, and then he writes a book called True and False Reform in the Church. Roncalli, the nuncio in Paris, reads it, asks himself, can the church really be reformed? He was an outsider. He becomes Pope John the 23rd. He calls Vatican II Council. And now Congar and his colleague Marie-Dominique Chenu became experts in the council. When I entered the Dominicans in Mexico, these two guys were heroes because they were the teachers of my teachers, of several of my teachers in Mexico. So I was raised in the French Dominican Theological School. Les Olchois, the school they came from, which had been closed due to theological repression, I think in the 30s or 40s, including with enemies within the order itself, produced more experts for Vatican II than any other single place in my calculation. And so I was raised and trained as a Dominican, which I still consider myself to be at heart, in this school that is the whole renovation of theology in the church. Beginning with Lacordaire in France, he was also one of our heroes. And then Lagrange, which I also spoke about this morning, who is another example of a guy that was silenced for being too innovative in biblical studies, was told to stop writing about the Old Testament and denying that Moses wrote the whole Pentateuch, switched to New Testament, tremendous output, was told, leave the New Testament too, you're silenced, no more teaching. He obeyed, didn't rebel. 5 years after his death, Pope Pius XII comes out with the encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, basically approving of all of Lagrange's approaches and ideas. And 50 years after that, in 1993, the Pontifical Biblical Commission published the interpretation of the Bible in the church, where my professor of the letter to the Hebrews at the Biblicum, later Cardinal Vanois, Albert Vanois, insisted as secretary of the commission that Lagrange be rehabilitated by name. And they do that. They list them with Origen and Jerome. And in church speak, even though they didn't get the encouragement then that they now receive, men like, Bible scholars like. So, I mean, they made life miserable for him. And to make it even stranger, his cause of beatification, as I understand it, has been progressing now for years. So this proscribed man who was made to die under a cloud as to his orthodoxy is implicitly rehabilitated by none other than Pope Pius XII in 1943 encyclical Divino Afflante Spiritu, and then rehabilitated explicitly by name 50 years after that. So this is a Dominican experience. This is an experience of our limitations as church, an experience of evolution. The same experience the servant had, Jesus. They thought he was stricken by God and afflicted, a reprobate, a sinner, possessed by the devil, Beelzebub, a magician, a Samaritan, a mamzer, a bastard. All these things were said about Jesus. Ate with publicans and sinners. Allowed bleeding women to touch, menstruating women to touch him. Allowed a city sinner, people like to think she's a prostitute, cry over his feet while the Pharisee is observing whether this is correct or not. Touches a leper. I was reading about Father Damien yesterday of Molokai in Hawaii, who ate with the lepers and dipped his fingers in their food like they did and contracted leprosy, Hansen's disease, not the biblical leprosy, and died of it. So these are all examples of ethics. It's hard to, it's like, I was thinking about it, it's like the parable of the Good Samaritan, the legalist, which is what many people like to be. I was a lawyer, but the legalist, like the legal scholar in Luke, says, who is my neighbor? What is the jurisdiction of into which a person comes in to be my neighbor? And Jesus has a dynamic one, who became a neighbor. And the one who became a neighbor was the guy that you're not on speaking terms with, a Samaritan, an outcast, a foreigner. He's going to call the Samaritan in the 10 lepers that only one returns. He says, this foreigner, the Samaritan. I mean, treatment of foreigners and immigrants. I was checking channels the other day. They were all, the channels that I watch were looking at the assault on the Capitol, the invasion of the Capitol. I switched to Fox News, and they're talking about the invasion of the Central American immigrants who are trying to get into Mexico. They're far away from the U.S. border. That's a prime example of distraction. You have a problem right under your nose here, and you divert attention to these dark, miserable guys. They bring drugs, they're rapists. I assume some of them are good people. You distract attention by, and then of course you unleash the anger, and you publicize how you are cruel to these families, and that must be some sort of raw meat to the lions. Who in their right mind would want to do that? But if you're against abortion, that makes it okay. And the bishops think that. Many of them, not all of them, not Cardinal Kupish and others. I think these are ethical issues that I've tried to ventilate. Uh, and I think that, um, again, you have to discern the right way. And if you follow that manual, which is what they were doing in the 19th century and up to the time of Vatican II, they were going by manuals where all what the French would call ressourcement, going back to the sources of Christianity, all that stuff was bad because your manual said it was bad. That's a bad instance of non-discernment. And so, and now we have people that, I call it like when you are trying to expand your house, you need to expand it. It's too small. You have too many children or family members or something. The process of remodeling it is messy, dust and walls and things out of order. Would you either stay in your small house all neat but closed up and nobody else, or you go through the growing pain of expanding your house? And I think that is a metaphor for Vatican II and its yet unfulfilled mission, which is to dialogue and learn and walk with the people of God rather than impose from the top down uh, a static, uncreative, narrow-minded, obsolete model of Catholicism. Um, and the only way to really counteract that is to know history and to cultivate knowledge. I put the picture up of Simone Weil. She was in favor. She was a great philosopher, Jewish, non-practicing, and had a vision of Christ and became, for all intents and purposes, a non-baptized Catholic. And it seems that at the end of her life, at 35 years of age, in a London hospital, somebody baptized her. By the way, this great saint who went to the factories against her very nature, but she wanted to be with the workers. She died of starvation, probably deliberately. Again, that shadow of ambiguity and mixed bagness that should be one of our ethical uh, foundation stones to keep us humble and not angry or in rage against the wrong things, especially. Pope Simon was very much in favor of humane hours for workers so that they're not just animals producing objects, but actually have leisure time to study and learn some of the arts and music and be human like everyone else. That's important. That's why I talked a little bit about politics. That's ethics. It's not reducing it to one thing and rage and then everything else is a mess. Hitler was not ethical. And he should have been stopped. Bonhoeffer tried to stop him, assassinate him. Tyrannicide is licit. I did a study on tyrannicide, including, if I pronounce it right, the Regimini Principum, the Aquinas' treatise on how princes should govern themselves. And then you also have John of Salisbury on killing a tyrant. Even Saint Pope Paul VI in Populorum Progressio, number 30, if I'm not mistaken, talks about removing a tyrant, except that you have to be very, very, very careful about what you're doing and calculate whether the consequences of what you're going to do are going to be better or worse than what you have. But the point being that when Yves Congar went to Vatican II, all these bishops who had been consulted for the first time, rather than rubber stamp everything the Pope said, they were actually consulted by John the 23rd, much like Pope Francis sent out questionnaires on the family out, and a lot of dioceses didn't even want to distribute them. But the Pope, John the 23rd, consulted the bishops, and the bishops wanted to talk and say something and be part of a college of apostles, successors. And they would bombard Congar and Chenou and everybody else with questions. They were learning, soaking up all this knowledge that the church had done things very differently if you only knew its history. If your framework in that little house would be torn down and all of a sudden you saw the big horizon, wow, all that happened, all those things were possibilities back then and throughout 2,000 years. You mean this manual doesn't contain the whole thing? And that's how you get Vatican II. And the voting was, 2,000 to 5 or something in most of these constitutions. So I think that's part of ethics: dynamics, growth, evolution, openness, and the realization that we are limited, mixed bags, listening to what God may be saying and listening to those who appear to have the Spirit of God or of Christ, as Paul would say. I think Pope Francis has it. He has it very deeply. And sometimes it actually makes you have to be a little kenotic, to empty yourself a little bit of things you are holding on to when he's calling you to let go. It's hard to do that, but I think God is all about that, and the cross is all about that. And with that, I'm going to stop.